Okay, good. So I guess we'll introduce ourselves. My name is Catherine Kiska-Schultz. I'm an associate professor at Clemson University. My colleague Scott.
Yes, and hello, everybody. I'm Scott Shackelford. I'm a professor of business law and ethics here at the Kelley School of Business at Indiana University. We also have the pleasure of directing several of our research centers, which I'll mention in just a minute.
Yeah, so we're just going to introduce this research that started about a year and a half ago with our colleague Janine Hiller at Virginia Tech, but we wanted to look at a broader picture of cybersecurity and how to further incentivize investment in cybersecurity. And this particular research paper that we focused on is more so related to looking at the for-profit business sector as to how we can go ahead and incentivize cybersecurity in that arena. We realize that is one small area of where we need to take a look at cybersecurity and how to better boost it for the entire ecosystem. And that can include things like not-for-profit sector and governmental agencies and individuals even. But for this particular research, we wanted to very much focus on the for-profit business sector.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to go ahead and forward here, and I'll just introduce this concept. Just a quote that sort of starts off our research paper in general. It's just this notion that cybersecurity is an area that really embodies everything. And when everyone is cyber secure, it benefits everyone. And when we have cybersecurity problems, it really negatively impacts a lot of us, the entire arena, the entire environment. And so when we were looking at this particular research project, we did take a sort of really hard, thoughtful ideal of how in the world can we use tax to help incentivize and protect the broader cybersecurity ecosystem that I think is one of the pinnacles of what we're looking at in cybersecurity, at least in the current environment that we're in. So Scott, I'll let you go ahead and talk for a bit.
Sure. No, thanks so much, Catherine. And we just wanted to say up front that we recognize, of course, that this is, one small part of a much bigger jigsaw puzzle that we need to put together to better manage the full range of cyber risks facing organizations, including critical infrastructure providers, as we'll talk more about in a moment. But it's one of those understudied areas, which is why we decided to focus on it in this particular piece. As I mentioned just a moment ago, other than being a professor here at IU, I also have the pleasure of directing the Ostrom Workshop, which if you're not familiar, we'll put a link up in just a moment, but it's been an epicenter for governance research of all kinds for more than 50 years now. The common thread has been the governance of different common pool resources and public goods. And there's an active debate right now about whether cybersecurity should be considered one of those public goods along with national security, right? And if so, what greater role should the government have in incentivizing it? Hence our focus on tax here. I also direct our Center for Applied Cybersecurity Research at IU, which is more operational and focuses on, among other things, helping to protect critical infrastructure, including local communities across Indiana and beyond. So you can see why this particular project has been so near and dear to my heart. And again, thanks go first and foremost to Catherine and Janine for shepherding it through this whole process, and to the editors of the Wall Street Journal, which have given it very kindly some attention this last week as part of their new cybersecurity section. So just very briefly, since I know this is probably well-trodden ground for a lot of the audience, cyber attacks have been a problem for many years now, including cyber attacks on critical infrastructure providers, such as the core internet backbone. That dates back in a lot of ways to the Morris worm, right? Morris worm was famously deployed way back in November 1988 by a grad student who infected MIT's network with what became the first DDoS attack. He didn't mean to do it. It was a research project, but the damage was so severe that the nascent internet basically had to be partitioned, restarted. And there were some professors here in Indiana, like Jane Spafford up at Purdue, who really took a lead in getting us out from this conundrum that the Morris worm got us in. And that led to all kinds of things, including the world's first cyber emergency response team being established. Oh, and the first prosecution under the brand new Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. Though we shouldn't feel too sorry for Roger, of course, he's now a professor at MIT and a dot-com millionaire. So things didn't work out too poorly for the world's first cyber attacker. What's different now, of course, is how quickly these attacks have proliferated in numbers, sophistication, and severity, and the fact that they're targeting companies, countries, and local communities. As we see here, the amount of attacks, the amount of damages, for example, per ransomware incident have only been increasing over time. We'll be talking about that more during the presentation. And the problem is only getting more acute because of this rapidly expanding Internet of Things, this notion that more and more stuff, from our cars to smart factories, to local water treatment facilities, are being connected to the internet, oftentimes by operators that might not have the capabilities to understand the risks of doing so. I'm reminded of a community we were helping a few years ago that had a new way to log into their wastewater treatment facility. And it was a remote login. It wasn't protected by any type of multi-factor authentication, and it was downstream from Indianapolis, which could have caused a world of hurt potentially. So it's those types of issues that I've become more and more focused on over the years, and trying to figure out new ways to incentivize the uptake of different types of best practices to better mitigate those, right? And that applies in the critical infrastructure context, as you see here on the right of the screen, with Colonial Pipeline being one really front page news example over the last few years, as well as those run-of-the-mill ransomware attacks that unfortunately are happening every day, such as happened to the city of Oakland just yesterday. So Catherine, if you wouldn't mind. And we can tag team these as well as we go, okay? So if you have more to add, please don't hesitate, Catherine.
Sure.
But, obviously, cyber attacks have been a particularly concerning during the pandemic over the last few years. We've seen the number and type of ransomware attacks hitting hospitals, clinics, even insurance companies really skyrocket. That, in some ways started with the Anthem breach, at least public attention to it back in 2014, but it's really gotten in some ways out of control since then. That's not just a problem in the US, it's a problem around the world. Here in the US, we've long had a very sector-specific approach to both cybersecurity and data privacy. So we don't treat all types of data equally. It matters if it's financial data, if it's health data, for example. It is regulated more stringently, for example, under HIPAA. And there are security and privacy rules to go along with that. We don't take the omnibus approach of the likes of the EU, and with educational data, such as under FERPA. So in some ways, if you're in one of these core critical infrastructure sectors that Congress has passed some of this legislation to address, that's helped address some of these challenges. But what we haven't seen is across the board reform. That started to change last year in some ways because, frankly, of the war in Ukraine galvanized attention in a way that really hadn't been the case all the times that this had come up before. And we saw that, for example, in the requirements for CISA now to enact new rules, which are still in the notice and comment period right now, for mandatory ransomware reporting. So for the first time, we're going to have a good view of the type of ransomware attacks hitting, for example, healthcare and educational institutions. That's going to be high level. It's going to take some time to build those data sets and to make them widely utilized and useful for research, for practitioners and policymakers. But that's going to be a much more useful foundation to get a better handle on all the nuance and all the different types and aspects of the cyber risks we face. Anything you wanted to add to that, Catherine, before we move on?
I don't think so. I think you're doing a great job, Scott.
Oh, hey, no. Please don't hesitate. So as we mentioned a moment ago, this is not only a problem, of course, for large multinational corporations, though, of course, that gets a lot of attention when those happen. We can think back to, SolarWinds, et cetera, NotPetya before that. This is really a problem, and one that we're really interested in this research for small businesses, for local communities. Having said that, not all of these businesses, needless to say, have the same amount of resources, sophistication, as we've alluded to better manage, in some cases, which are very sophisticated types of attacks, which, as we'll turn to in just a few minutes, led us to think through the different types of incentives that might be useful at the state and federal level for getting a better handle on these different aspects of cyber risks, including this really thorny issue of ransomware that doesn't seem to be going away.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a challenge, right? We've seen this in a number of fronts because of the changing nature. In some ways that's driven by the growth of AI, which is both useful for offensive and defensive, cyber risk mitigation and attack. That opens up new avenues, for example, for small businesses that can't find trained personnel if they have the budget, but at the same time, that's already leading to something of an arms race. There's a lot of related issues here around, for example, content moderation, chatbots. We don't get into that in the paper. We can certainly talk more about it if there's questions along those lines. Already, we've seen the likes of ChatGPT being used to find bugs in programs, for example, which and also just a program using English, right? Imagine that. So you wouldn't have to learn the likes of Python anymore. So that those types of things could potentially have a big impact on the likes of small business cybersecurity, but it's very early stages there. But we are interested in, some of these bigger topics of, all right, if there is, for example, a market failure when it comes to cybersecurity, if we're not doing a good enough job of internalizing the costs of cyber attacks to organizations, which has been the case for years now, and that's been backed up by reports, for example, from the National Bureau of Economic Research, then the question naturally, and if we think about cybersecurity as a public good, as we said a few minutes ago, the question becomes, well, how can we better internalize that? How can we think through those negative externalities and really promote this shared responsibility of cybersecurity throughout the ecosystem, including these incredibly complex supply chains? And there clearly are already some tools out there. SBOM comes to mind, the software bill of materials, which has gotten a lot of attention since it was first announced, and can be useful in promoting some transparency, some visibility. CMMC, another example, but these are still at a pretty early stage. And if we're looking to make wholesale change at scale, we don't feel, at least they're not at this moment, going to be able to basically make all boats rise as quickly as could be the case if we effectively leverage tax codes. That also goes the argument. Please.
No, and I'll step in here. When Janine and I first started talking about this idea in this particular paper, one of the things we were really concerned about was small businesses in particular. And we found in our research that about 60% of small businesses simply don't have any kind of cybersecurity protection whatsoever. And a lot of that is because they simply don't have the funding to come up with upfront cost in order to protect themselves. And so they have to look at this return on investment and kind of think, what's going to be more financially feasible for us, to do some upfront protections when we don't have the money to do so, or to wait and see if we actually end up having a cyber attack and see what in the world ends up happening. Can we afford it? Can we pay for that? Some of these companies have simply had to fold because of bankruptcy because they couldn't afford to deal with a cyber attack that was launched against them. And it's really interesting. We have this quote down here from the U.S. Secret Service that said, basically every entity, regardless of size, should adopt basic cybersecurity hygiene and best practices. Well, that's a really great ideal out there, but without some form of assistance, it's a moot issue because there are tons of small businesses that simply cannot afford this upfront cost to go ahead and do that. And so I think when we look at cybersecurity and really this environment, and I think Scott did a great job of talking about, healthcare and finance, areas that are already regulated and have to have those cybersecurity measures in place. And then we think of large businesses, about 94% of large businesses invest in cybersecurity, but then we really focus on the small business sector and have great concerns because, again, cybersecurity is sort of an environment where we need to think of the big picture. And, when we have failures in one arena, it's going to impact other arenas. And so one of the items that we really wanted to focus on, even in, this discussion and in this research, was how do we assist these small businesses that simply cannot fund the upfront costs associated with cybersecurity?
Mm-hmm. That's right, Catherine. And to go along with that, there's still quite a lot of attention on treating cybersecurity through the lens of pure cost benefit analysis, right? Mm-hmm. And that's really challenging because it's not always clear. In fact, oftentimes it's not clear. What are the benefits of an extra added dollar in different types of cybersecurity best practices, whether that might be something as basic as multi-factor or something more advanced like end-to-end encryption, or zero trust, right? Or for that matter, purchasing cyber risk insurance. Same thing, of course, on the cost side. How long are you talking? What's the time horizon? What's the supply chain look like? So because of the challenges there. And not to say that, treating it solely as a matter of something like corporate social responsibility is easier, straightforward, and that has its own challenges. But still, we think, using this broader aperture to consider cybersecurity risk management, and seeing how tax can fit within that can inform some of those conversations and make them hopefully go a little bit more smoothly going forward. And we've seen some, action there. We've seen some movement at the federal level, as we mentioned before, with that mandatory ransomware reporting. And the rise of, CISA to go along with that, along with new actions, for example, from the SEC that are putting on more and more requirements for boards of directors to disclose, for example, how many members of their board have cybersecurity training or expertise. That's something that we haven't seen before, and that's already having an impact. The Federal Trade Commission, of course, is getting more and more active, not only on the antitrust front, but also using its Section 5 authority to look at unfair and deceptive trade practices in the cybersecurity context. And there's more and more proposals to give them, frankly, more authority to do so. And we mentioned a moment ago, of course, these other supply chain related initiatives, including CMMC and SBOM, which are having an impact here in the US and also globally, given how much effort, for example, DHS is putting in to have more countries adopt the SBOM framework, with the idea that if we can pool our procurement resources, that can also move markets. But as we see here, there's a lot of action at the state level. We're doing another piece called Defining Reasonable Cybersecurity, which is coming out in the Yale Law and Technology Journal, I think in the next month. And that's been an interesting project because we did this state level analysis to really see how different states are defining, as Catherine said a moment ago, what is reasonable, right? And, some states are getting quite specific in that regard, like California, dating back to 2016, has tied their definition of reasonability to the Center for Internet and Security, the CIS, the now top 18 security controls. Whereas other states like Ohio have adopted more of a menu, right? Where basically you can select from a series of different cybersecurity frameworks, like the NIST cybersecurity framework. And if you can show that that's been adopted, and if your company is still breached, then it operates as a sort of liability shield to kind of limit the results of any liability and litigation in the aftermath of a breach. So we see a lot of experimentation happening there, which is, of course, putting more pressure on Congress, right, to help address that, given the challenges for businesses operating across state lines. A lot of private sector initiatives that are related to all of this on codes of conduct. Here in the US, I'm thinking the Siemens Charter of Trust, the Cybersecurity Tech Accord, it's a laundry list. But also we're seeing more of these being encouraged globally, including by the EU under GDPR. There's an article that actually calls out and promotes the development of codes of conduct to go along with these more global efforts to adopt these 11 cyber norms that were agreed to by the UN just in 2021. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of the landscape. Catherine, anything else you'd like to highlight?
No, I mean, it's definitely a patchwork of regulatory landscape. And for the most part, Scott, correct me if I'm wrong, but really more often than not, a voluntary approach for cybersecurity outside the, specific federal regulations for certain arenas. It's really been more of a voluntary approach that we've met. So you have a patchwork of voluntary approaches that clearly, as we look at historic cyber attacks moving on towards current cyber attacks, it's not working because they're only increasing not only in size but in scope and across so many sectors that have no regulatory requirements. And so I think that what we have in place is helpful, but it isn't getting us to where we need to be nationally or globally at this point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, indeed. We've been more reliant, you're exactly right on that, and that sort of, voluntary bottom-up sector-specific approach, really dating back to, you could honestly put it to 1999 with the adoption of the Presidential Decision Directive 63, which really set the roadmap for US cybersecurity policy, which has been so influential globally for decades. And there's bipartisan, agreement that hasn't worked out well, despite, presidents of both parties following it by and large over the last couple of decades. One thing that hasn't been done, though, is trying out more with the federal and state tax codes, which is what we're turning to now.
Sure. So a big part of this research, when Janine and I first started talking about this about a year and a half ago, and then brought Scott on board with us, was, is there some way that we can leverage the, tax policy to try and help incentivize increased investment in cybersecurity infrastructure? And, one of the ideas that we came up with is just sort of focusing on this kind of carrots and sticks approach that our US tax code takes with a lot of different arenas. And why not cybersecurity? Why not look at this, from the lens of tax policy and say, is there a way to create a more tailored sticks and carrots arena that we can try to utilize for purposes of cybersecurity infrastructure? I do want to tip my hat to everybody who has been out there who has already proposed some form of tax utilization towards cybersecurity investment. This is not a novel idea. We are not the first people to ever tie the terms tax and cybersecurity together. In fact, there is a strong handful of academic scholars who have written on this topic. There have been policymakers who have come forward. There have been white papers, one that I can think of from MIT that has come forward. So we are definitely not the first people to consider this approach. However, what we've seen historically is a lot of this has been more generic in nature, suggesting, oh, let's use tax credits to try and help incentivize cybersecurity, or maybe a little bit more than that. But really what we haven't seen so far in the literature is a well-designed proposal. And that proposal, kind of encapsulates everything that we understand about cybersecurity, and sort of working through this notion that what we don't think is going to work is some blanket tax approach across all entities and all, sizes and industry, but rather a more tailored approach that does take into consideration both carrots as in tax credits and sticks as in perhaps a tax applied to businesses. And so what we did was look at everything that was already out there that has been proposed and say, what can we do to make this bigger and really get this discussion started? And so that was the purpose behind this particular research. And looking at tax from this perspective, it makes sense. As I said, the US tax system already has a carrots and sticks approach. It's utilized in a number of ways. We see it, as I have your sin taxes and Pigouvian taxes, of course, the R&D tax credit that's out there, that's trying to enhance research and development. We use that as a carrot that's available. Tax expenditure, social welfare, as I have here. This is not a novel idea to take the tax code and try and use it to either incentivize activity, or perhaps, try and cut down on certain behaviors. And so it makes sense to look at this from the lens of taxation. We also see it not just at the federal level, but at the state level. And I have multiple examples here, but tax incentives are used for a number of things to incentivize technology and agriculture and media production. All of you folks are sitting in my hometown area of DC right now who are live, and I'm born and raised in the Arlington, Virginia area, and here we have Amazon's second headquarters that is now there, and I think they were given somewhere in the realm of $800 million in tax incentives and investment to go ahead and bring HQ2 to the Arlington area. So we see this from a state-specific area as well. And when we did a little more, deep diving into cybersecurity, and we did this from a global perspective, there is only one jurisdiction globally that has actually thus far successfully implemented any form of cybersecurity tax incentive, and that is the state of Maryland, not too far from where you are right now. And they went ahead back in 2008 and brought forward the Buy Maryland Cybersecurity Tax Credit. That is a tax credit that is made available to those who try and implement some kind of cybersecurity infrastructure. There is a max per year that they are willing to pay out in that state, but it was the first type of tax credit that's been made available. Of course, Maryland then came out in 2021 with the Maryland Innovation Investment Tax Credit that is more in line with trying to incentivize parties to invest in Maryland businesses that deal with all sorts of technology sectors, including cybersecurity. But really, that's it. That's where we are here at a global standpoint on how to incentivize cybersecurity with tax. So what we also did was just look and say, well, if Maryland's the only one globally, what has happened, if anything, at the federal level? And so we did some research, to try and find every single solitary piece of information we could on what has been introduced at the federal level. And there have been recommendations for a cybersecurity tax credits. Much of that has also been relatively generic. I want to be quite frank. There hasn't been a whole lot of very heavy, deep thinking, fleshing this idea out, but it has been introduced multiple times starting in 2011. In 2015, we had the Cyber Information Sharing Tax Credit that never passed. Again, in 2016, we had the Data Breach Insurance Act that was also to assist in this. That never passed. And what we see both in the Trump administration and in the Biden administration is that there have been recommendations federally to try and consider introducing some kind of cybersecurity tax credit, and it just hasn't been done yet. And so it's been a bit of a stalemate. Much of the argument is the cost. There is definitely a cost to implementing tax credits because that is going to be revenue taken away from the federal government. And that's a reality that we deal with. One of the reasons why we've introduced this concept of a carrots and sticks approach is to try and offset some of the lost revenue that you might have from the carrot side with revenue coming in from the stick side. So we can sort of try and, meet somewhere, maybe not in the middle, but try and offset some of that loss that would be there at the federal level. But it's an interesting concept that we haven't been able to do anything yet at the federal level, even though there have been multiple recommendations to do so. And I do just want to point out very briefly that, of course, businesses can use research and development tax credits in order to develop and integrate cybersecurity technologies. And there are, of course, tax deductions available to businesses to try and, deal with certain costs associated with cybersecurity. But again, kind of like our patchwork of regulations that are already out there, it's not enough. How do we know it's not enough? Because we're still having growing increased problems. And so our goal was to try and look a little bit deeper into this and determine how can tax incentives, maybe what we say, move this needle on cybersecurity to try and bolster the entire ecosystem out there. And as I said earlier, one size fits all approach is not going to be as effective than a more tailored offering. We have different size businesses. We have different businesses in industry that some are regulated, some are unregulated. And so what we wanted to do in sort of crafting this ideal is to really take a look at this not so much broadly and just say a tax credit, but how can we tailor this to fit the needs of both the business sector and national security in general to try and get everyone up and running on a more sophisticated level of cybersecurity protection. And so we developed a 3-tier proposal that starts with a targeted federal cybersecurity investment tax credit, followed by a cyber insecurity penalty, one of which we have some samples, but could be a tax on cyber insecurity. And then we offer some proposed tools to further help sort of develop this idea and see if we can't find other mechanisms to make this all work together. But I'm going to, first and foremost, I'm going to walk through these. If you are not a tax person, or it's not even easy to sit here and do this when I can't even see the reactions coming from the audience out there. But I do want to say, please feel free. We're always happy to share this paper. It's out on SSRN. And so if you want to take a look at more of our perception of what this is, I think the paper might be very helpful to take a look at. But one of the things that we started with regard to this FCIT credit is we built in 3 subcategories of this, and we call those FCIT Core, FCIT Advanced, and then FCIT Eco. And the policy behind these FCIT Core credits is really to raise the level of cybersecurity defense and resilience across the broader ecosystem. And we're really targeting those small and medium-sized businesses that simply don't have the upfront funding to be able to even get a baseline level of cybersecurity investment in their business. And so when we look at the FCIT Core, which we'll talk about a little bit more in just a moment when we tie all this together, we're really looking at just trying to establish across the entire for-profit industry arena in the United States a baseline level of security, cybersecurity that should be invested in. Our FCIT Advanced is to recognize and enforce responsibility for best practices in businesses that are over and above what would be required for FCIT core. So one of the theories we have is to qualify for an FCIT advanced tax credit, you would first have to meet what the requirements are of FCIT core. So this would be a next level investment and say, we're going to go beyond baseline. We're actually going to go ahead and invest more and get advanced cybersecurity protections involved in our business enterprise. And then finally, our FCIT Eco is really looking more at a collaborative effort, taking these big companies, our large companies, our companies that maybe already have regulatory requirements such as healthcare or finance, and some large companies that have the funding to already be able to invest in cybersecurity, and really have them collaborate with small and mid-sized businesses to help strengthen the broader cybersecurity, teach them, educate them, keep them up to date on what some of the cybersecurity requirements are. So our FCIT Eco credits are really about collaboration and teaching for those type of businesses that have the ability to do that for those smaller and mid-sized businesses. And so when we look at all of these three credits, what we wanted to do was tailor them to entity type. And so we crafted three different entity types that we were able to kind of wrap our heads around on. And so we have cyber regulated entities, which we don't even care about size when we think of cyber regulated entities. These are those businesses that are already operating within some kind of regulatory cybersecurity environment. So our healthcare, our financial arenas would fall into this particular category. Then we identified cyber integrated entities. Again, regardless of size, small, medium, or large, we're talking about businesses whose function is either cybersecurity related or the Internet of Things. So we're thinking, for example, companies like Mandiant and Verizon that already are working in a cybersecurity environment that is part of their working arena, even if they're not per se required to fall within a regulatory standard that's already established at the federal level. And then finally, our third type of entity are our general entities that fall outside the scope of either of the first two. It's kind of a catch-all category. And we subdivide our general entity by size. So we have our micro and our small and medium and our large. And as we put in our paper, McKinsey & Company has a really great way to kind of divide and define each of these general entity sizes. And so as part of our paper, we make a recommendation that we can follow what McKinsey identifies for each of these entity sizes. So here's just an illustration that we offer in our research that really just illustrates these three categories of entities, from our cyber integrated to our cyber regulated to our to our third category of general. And then again, this is sort of just an illustration of what I was just talking about, but what types of businesses fall within each one of these three categories. And then once we developed our three categories of credits and then our three categories of type of entity, what we've done is create an illustration of where all of this comes together. And so where we have our FCIT core credits, which are really just those baseline credits, you qualify for these credits by getting baseline cybersecurity measures. And by the way, and Scott, you can fill in here if you'd like, but when we were identifying baseline requirements, of course, some federal agency is going to have to come in and assist with this. The IRS is incapable of being able to identify what would be baseline cybersecurity measures. And so there would have to be some collaboration between the IRS and federal agencies to assist with this. And I think some of the areas that we were talking about is the NIST framework that could be utilized to try and come up with some baseline requirements. To CMMC model is also another one. And we just throw these out there as examples, but we, in our research, were able to find some key areas that could be utilized to try and come up with these FCIT core baseline requirements. And then as you see in this illustration, the companies that would qualify for FCIT core credits would be our micro, small, and medium size companies in that general category. the reason we look at this from this perspective, we don't want to offer tax credits to cyber regulated entities that already have a requirement to be regulated. We don't want to offer them funds to get baseline cybersecurity. They have to have it anyway. And so we're taking them outside the limits of that box. Or our cyber integrated entities that already work in the cyber security arena, we don't want to offer them FCIT core credits, because again, they need cybersecurity already simply by the model of business entity that they run. And so we focus on offering FCIT core just to those general micro, small, and medium entities. Then when we expand outside of that, we look at the FCIT advanced. Again, these are our tax credits that would be made available over and above those entities that already meet the FCIT core requirements. Now we're talking about, again, small, micro, medium-sized entities, business entities that have achieved CSP. If they want to go the next step and get the next level of cybersecurity investment, they would qualify for FCIT advanced credits. Or select entities in compliance with CSPs would also qualify in this FCIT advanced arena for credits. And then finally, our FCIT Eco is the greatest bubble that would encompass any of this, but really what we're focusing on for FCIT Eco are those cyber regulated entities, those cyber integrated entities that are willing to collaborate with our small, medium, micro businesses that are outside the scope of having regulatory requirements or work, outside the scope of cybersecurity in general, but that might need additional mentorship, if you will, and collaboration to try and better secure themselves. And so companies that are willing to collaborate with smaller companies would qualify for this FCIT eco style tax credit. So in a nutshell, and I know this is probably a lot for anyone out there sitting here listening to this, but in a nutshell, we were trying to find a way to not make this a blanket approach, but to make it a step-by-step process for qualification that in some way, shape, or form would assist everyone from the micro and small and medium companies all the way to those big regulated companies who are willing to assist smaller companies and unregulated businesses to become more cyber secure in and of themselves through collaborative efforts. And then alongside the carrot side, which is what I've just introduced, we also wanted to propose a sticks approach to this as well. There's plenty of research that's out there to suggest that utilizing sticks can be as effective, if not sometimes more effective, than offering tax credits. And so we propose several options how we could use some kind of penalty associated with cyber insecurity. So for example, we could disincentivize postures that may prevent avoidable security harms by levying a tax on businesses that are compromised from a cybersecurity perspective. So impose a tax on businesses that have been attacked based on number of records compromised or volume of people impacted, or the strategic value of trade secrets that are involved or whatnot. Impose a tax for those who have failed to already implement baseline cybersecurity measures that were available under the credit scheme. Another option is to just assess a cybersecurity tax on all businesses, no matter what, across the United States, all for-profit businesses. And then we'd look to this in a similar ideal as we would for workers' comp, that those businesses that don't suffer losses, that are cyber secure, that can maintain some kind of secured level and successfully keep attacks off, would have very low tax rates associated with them. But those who continuously are attacked or have more breaches and are less secure, the tax rates would increase based on those scenarios. And then another option is a clawback of any of those FCIT credits that we've proposed for a certain period of time after an attack or occurrence has occurred, that you have to re-earn your ability to get back into those qualifying for those credits. And so these are, again, just some samples of what we'd propose as potential cyber insecurity penalties that would go along with identifying cyber carrot or cybersecurity tax carrots available. And then finally, we just have some added considerations to enhance what we call this whole tax toolkit. Some of this might work, some of it might not work. We might have to go even bigger than what we're talking about right now, even if we were able to implement some kind of federal cybersecurity tax credits, but things that we're looking at in addition to, or maybe, in tandem with federal cybersecurity injury prevention loans, or exemption permits for small businesses to be able to reinvest their federal tax obligations into cybersecurity infrastructure so they can get those front end funds to try and be more cyber secure. Targeted educational credits to train workers and address some of the workforce shortage that we have in cybersecurity. We do understand there are costs to calculate all of this, and those need to be examined. And we definitely speak about that in this research. There is going to be a cost associated with implementing any of this, and that includes even what rates to use for any of our ideals. We propose a few possibilities in this research paper, but certainly there's a cost associated with this that would need to be examined. Also, this idea of the global minimum corporate tax rate that's very heavily discussed right now. I teach an international tax class, and this is coming up quite a bit with my students about this possibility. Could we use that to maybe leverage an ideal to incorporate a cybersecurity component in there that isn't there right now? So we could look at this maybe more at a global perspective than just a US national perspective. And then also maybe creating some targeted R&D tax credits for emerging areas like cybersecurity or 5G or quantum computing or artificial intelligence. These are just additional areas that we think could and probably should be examined in conjunction with the ideal that we have proposed. And I do want to just state our research and our proposal here does not have to be the end all, and it doesn't have to be the answer. It is the start of a really important discussion that we do need to look at this from a deeper perspective. We do need to consider the realistic ability of using tax to incentivize cybersecurity, and not just from a blanket approach of suggesting a tax credit, but really looking into this in a more deeper, focused arena. And that's what we've tried to do with this paper. And of course, we welcome suggestions, we welcome ideas, we welcome more of this discussion, because I think it is an important area that, that should be looked at and considered much more deeply. And as Scott said, the Wall Street Journal was really interested in it. We're super excited that they were. Just yesterday, our article, a short article on our research in this area was published in the Wall Street Journal, both online. You can find it there. And Scott, I'm not sure, was it in the actual newspaper? I'm unsure yet, but
it was today.
That's what I thought. I thought it came out. So
and a special cybersecurity kind of insert today. So yeah.
Yeah. So this is something that, even the Wall Street Journal finds important to post out there and say, let's get this discussion started. So with that, let's get this discussion started. Does anyone have any questions out there that we can try or commentary? We're willing to take any of it.
I have a question.
Please.
So what it would be like on the individual level, like me sitting at home on the Zoom, like where is my incentive to want my tax dollars to go to that, like for having companies invest in cybersecurity? Like what is the threat to me individually if we're not secure?
Scott, you might, I can probably answer this generically. You might have a better answer to that.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And that's where the rubber meets the road, right? Because there's trade-offs when we talk about, tax policy or any type of government spending, right? I mean, by doing this, are we not funding more, climate credits or whatever it might be? I think we should care because frankly, lots of businesses aren't incentivized right now to take your privacy and your data stewardship seriously, right? That's why we've seen the number of data breaches that we've had. And sometimes, people are fed up enough that they, can sue in the aftermath of that and get some compensation to get their data back. But that's a really reactive model, right? And that puts a lot of onus on individuals and regulators. And as I mentioned, we have seen some action from the FTC, but they're overloaded, frankly, by the number of breaches that have been happening. Same with state's attorney general, right? So this ideally promotes a more proactive model, so you don't wait for the breach and try to make somebody whole in the aftermath, but it puts down incentives to help make sure that your data isn't breached to begin with. That's the best case scenario, right? But I think you're right to point out, which I think you're alluding to. I mean, this It could be costly. This is a concept that it's at an early stage. I'm thinking of an alternative like flood insurance, right? And we've seen the public back option for flood insurance really skyrocket as the impacts of climate change and coastal areas have been seen more and more, right? So that's why, as Catherine really did a wonderful job of walking through, we propose, this very targeted tiered approach. So it's not just the government being on the hook for subsidizing all types of cybersecurity investments, but just those that have the most, frankly, bang for their buck and having the greatest chance of protecting your data.
Well, and I think also when we think about some of these cyber attacks, I think at the onset of them historically, I think it was maybe less impactful on individuals one-on-one. We would see this on the news and see this, but it was almost more this theoretical idea out there that we were just being introduced to. More often than not, I think that we are seeing this hit us at a very individualized personal level. I can even think with the Colonial Pipeline. I mean, I'm down here in South Carolina and I could not find gasoline for my car for what seemed probably about, I don't know, 10, 15 days. And when we could find, a pump that was open, we would have to sit for about an hour and a half in line waiting. And so I think what we see here with some of these cyber attacks is it does hit the individual level because we are being personally impacted. I'm actually doing another paper right now on data taxation. And when you think of just getting online and doing a search and your data is being siphoned off, to big tech companies who then go ahead and put it through the ringer, and then third parties are out there purchasing it. Well, there is a lot of argument that there is not a whole lot of cyber protection when your data is being sold to third parties. And again, that can result in, various down the road, cyber issues, cyber attacks based on our personal data. So when you're sitting behind your computer thinking, do I want, any of my tax dollars to go and protect me against this? I think the answer is yes.
But, great question.
Perfect question.
Because that's exactly one of the things that we debated and grappled with a lot as we were working on this paper. Any other questions?
It's Friday afternoon.
We're good.
All right. Cool.
Suspenseful.
Yeah, no worries. I'm just
There's
putting
one question in chat.
Oh, is there one in chat? Oh, great. I see the Q&A.
Oh,
Yeah.
I didn't even see that. Sorry.
Do we know what the primary drivers are for companies that choose not to prioritize data security? Julie was wanting to know. I think it's a great question, Julie. I think there's a number of drivers. One is just, especially if you're not operating in one of those critical infrastructure sectors where there isn't a federal statute or a state law that's really on point, you're having to guess quite a lot still about what reasonable cybersecurity is. Maybe there's a contractual relationship, maybe you have from a supplier, maybe you're a vendor to the federal government, for example, and there's some procurement requirements built in for you to follow the NIST cybersecurity framework, something like that. But it's not like we have a version of GDPR where there's a clear set of regulations and expectations around data governance, more or less across the board. So I think confusion, in other words, is one of those drivers for why we don't see more prioritization and such, frankly, a fragmented approach to spending on security. There's also, just legitimate confusion about, all right, even if you do decide to prioritize this, where should you be focusing those investments? As we said, I mean, there's not been a lot of work, a lot of studies that have been able to definitively show, for example, that it's better to invest in multi-factor than encryption or something along those lines. And in fact, a lot of these core security controls go hand in hand and build on one another. So I think it's a lack of hard data. It's a lack of just clarity around what those best practices are that I think is causing a lot of this confusion. And this this approach of leveraging the tax code, this is not going to solve all that. On the other hand, if we do have state governments and federal governments pointing to specific, for example, foundational provisions and saying, hey, these, if nothing else, we know technology is going to change quickly. We're not trying to pick winners and losers, but we think some of these fundamental ideas like multi-factor authentication aren't going anywhere for quite some time. And if we can incentivize their uptake, I think that would really do a a lot, especially for small businesses, to kind of get a better handle on this problem. And that just goes hand in hand with some of these other reforms that we're seeing, like the Cyber Safety Review Board at DHS, which is now putting out some of these authoritative reports so that we have a better idea for what went wrong, like with SolarWinds. And of course, the ransomware reporting that we mentioned earlier. But Catherine, please, if you have some additional thoughts or.
Yeah, I just think also just going back to the, small businesses, as we kind of alluded to earlier in this presentation, but just the return on investment. Is it cost effective for them to prioritize cybersecurity up front versus wait and see, on the back end, whether they actually suffer an attack and then whether they can keep running their business following that economically. But I think that prioritization also goes hand in hand with, can we afford it, especially for some of these smaller companies, that it just may be very overly costly for them to do it up front without assistance.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's it. I put my email address in the chat there as well, and folks are welcome to reach out with any other, questions that they might have.
Sure, I'll do the same.
Neat. Well, thank you.
Hey, thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you very much. This was really enjoyable.
Thank you very much. Have a good weekend.
Thanks, you both as well. Take care.
Bye, guys.